In this video, we're going to deep dive into Gemini CLI. We're going to look into how we can get started with Gemini CLI. Then we are going to look into some CLI command options as to what options we can give to Gemini when we are starting. Then we'll look into how we can configure it. For example, we can use the Gemini.md file, or you can use the agents.md file. So we'll look into what those different configurations are. And then we will wrap up everything with doing some hands-on. We'll look into how Gemini goes about understanding an existing project. And towards the end, let's get ambitious and just give it one big prompt and see if we can one-shot an application and build it completely end-to-end. So let's get started. So to get started, all that we need to do is npx and give the GitHub URL link, or we can do npm and we have to run this command. This is all assuming that you already have Node.js installed in your machine. So I've got it installed in my machine, so I can go straight to terminal. So I'm going to copy this command and I'm going to go to terminal and I'm just going to type it and say npm install Google Gemini CLI. And we can see that installing already. And there you go. It seems to have installed successfully. And to start Gemini, all I have to do is type Gemini, of course, and we have the Gemini all up and running. Then we have this option to choose the different themes. For example, it could be in ANSI dark, Atom 1 dark, and the default one. I quite like the Atom one, so I'm just going to choose that. And then it's asking me to log into Google. So we all have a personal account, so we can simply log in with our personal account. So I'm going to click on login with Google, and I'm going to choose my personal account to log into it. And once we are logged in, it says Gemini Code Assist and the Gemini CLI are now authorized to access your account. And we are logged in here and we are ready to go. And some of the tips it says is that ask questions, edit files, and run commands. Be specific for the best results, and create Gemini.md file to customize your interaction with Gemini, and /help for more information. For right now, I'm just going to type help and I'm going to see what it shows. It shows a bunch of keyboard shortcuts, and it shows also a list of commands that we can try out for and get familiarized with. So we'll probably run some of these commands to familiarize ourselves with it, and we'll also familiarize with the keyboard shortcuts. So to begin with, if I do Control C, I'm just going to quit the application. So I'm just going to do Control C and come out of it. And it says agent powering down, goodbye, and the performance is summarized straight away. Just for typing Gemini, we have quite a few options. For example, if we do Gemini help, then it's going to show us that we can change the model. By default, it's defaulting to Gemini 2.5 Pro. And if we say -- prompt, then we can directly write a prompt as in how you would interact with a chatbot. And the most interesting feature is the sandbox. So if you want to run a sandbox without affecting anything locally, then you can do so by providing a sandbox. For example, if you have a Docker image, then you can provide the sandbox image and then provide the image URI for the Docker image, and you should be able to run that image and do everything with Gemini inside of that. And if you want Gemini to show the memory usage, then we can pass this option. For example, if I do Gemini show memory usage and then start it, on the bottom right, we can see that the amount of memory usage keeps varying depending on what we type, and I can always quit and come out of it. And if you want to run the command automatically and accept all the actions that Gemini take, then you can simply pass a -y. And if you want to tweak any telemetry consent, you can always do that. And you can also checkpoint the files that are edited. And you can also allow specific MCP servers and restrict access to some of the MCP servers. And you can also extend the capabilities of Gemini CLI using the -e extensions command. And you can always list the different extensions that are available. And lastly, you can look at the version that's installed and also ask for help. Having said that, let's start the Gemini in the default mode. And over here, we seem to be having three different commands. One is the @ the next one is the exclamation mark, and the other one is the /. So let's look into each of the three now. If we do a /, we can see that that's clear. This is equivalent to running clear on the terminal. It's going to clear the Gemini's screen. And there's help, there's memory. So memory is interesting because if we do memory space, we can see that it shows the memory, we can add the memory, and we can refresh the memory. And if we look at the documentation, the memory is to manage the AI's instructional context, and the hierarchical memory is loaded from GEMINI.md. So there's something called the GEMINI.md, which we can define at 3 levels. One is the global level, and the next one is the project or ancestors level, and the next one is the subdirectories level. And each of these level, we can define Gemini.md, and the memory is pulled from this Gemini.md file. And by simply adding, we can add some context to the memory that's pulled from Gemini.md. And then we have the theme. Obviously, we can change the theme that we set when we actually started Gemini. And then this editor. So the editor could be, your VS Code, or could be any other editor you prefer, but we have to set an external editor preference. And then the stats on the current session that you're running. This lists the MCP server that you have configured. And similarly, we can list the extensions that are available with Gemini. And then we can also list the tools that are available. And there's also this chat. And this chat again is interesting because we can manage the conversation history. And for managing it, all that we have to do is chat space list. Currently, we don't have any saved conversations, but we can actually save it by running chat save and then giving some name. We can save a conversation. So in the documentation, it says save and resume conversation history for branching conversation state interactively, or resume a previous state from a later session. So basically, we can branch off and go to a completely different conversation and then get back to it. We can resume it, or we can save the current conversation. It's similar to how you deal with your GitHub repositories. And then there's another feature which is called the compress. Compresses the context by replacing with a summary. So if the context is pretty large and you want to understand what the context is, you can simply call compress, and it's going to show a compressed summary. Because we don't have much conversation here, it's not doing anything currently. And next comes the add symbol. So with add, we can pass any file. For example, I'm going to pass this cake.jpg, and I'm going to say what's going on in this image. And it's going to explain to me what's going on. This is a food photograph of a cake. The cake is on a wooden serving platter, which is on a dark tablecloth. So that is the image that it's talking about. There's a dark tablecloth. In the background, there's a white vase with some greenery, a container with utensils. So it's pretty much explaining what's going on in that file. So that's the usage of add. And the next one is very interesting, the exclamation mark. So the moment we hit exclamation mark, it changes to the shell mode, and the shell mode is enabled. This is quite handy. For example, if you want to do ls-l, it's going to list all the files that are available, and you can do whatever the shell commands that you want to execute. And if you want to toggle that, we need to hit exclamation mark, and we have come back to Gemini. In this mode, we won't be able to do any terminal command. For example, if I do ls-l, it will start thinking. It says it's analyzing details. And so quickly checking to the terminal mode is quite handy. But if I do exclamation mark and then do ls, then it's going to list all the files that are available. Now let's move on to how we can do Gemini CLI configuration. So for the configuration, there are different layers at which we can do it. For example, there are 6 layers available, and the default values is the hard-coded defaults within the application. The lower numbers are overwritten by the higher numbers. So whatever you define at the higher number is going to take precedence over the lower number. The degree of control is such that you have default values, and then you can have user level settings, project level settings, system level settings, and you can do environment variables through a .n file. And you can also do command line arguments when you're launching Gemini CLI. And the settings typically go in settings.json file. So when I install Gemini, the Gemini/setting.json file got created automatically in my home directory. If I go to my home directory and say cat Gemini settings.json, we can see that the theme that I chose is set here. I opted for the Atom1 theme when I actually installed Gemini, and there's also auth type, which defaults to OAuth personal. So these are the 2 settings that are there at the user level. And then this project level, where you can define the Gemini/settings.json within your project's root directory. You can have system level setting where, for example, in Linux, you can do /etc Gemini CLI settings.json. And for the Mac OS, obviously it's there in library application support Gemini CLI settings.json. So what goes on in the Gemini setting.json? So one of the things is that context file name. For example, you can have a Gemini.md where you specify instruction level context, and that configuration as to what that file is, whether it's agents.md or Gemini.md, that goes in the context file name. Similarly, you can have bug command. It overrides the default URL for the bug command. And then there's file filtering, and then code tools allows you to specify the list of code tools that should be made available to the model. So if you want to restrict the model to only a set of tools, then you can specify this as an array of strings. For example, the code tools are read file tool, glob tool, and the shell tool. If you want to find out what the tools that are available, you could do /tools, and it will say you what the tools available are, which is read folder, read file, and all of these, including Google search. So the Google search is enabled by default. And then this exclude tool, where you can give an array of tools that you need to exclude. For example, run shell command and find files. And you can similarly specify allowed MCP server, exclude MCP servers. You can specify auto accept. You can specify the theme, which we just saw. With that overview of what can go into settings.json, let's look at an example. We can see that in the settings.json, we have the theme, sandbox as the Docker, and we have the list of MCP servers, and the telemetry consent, for example, is enabled, and we have usage statistics is enabled. These are typically what goes into the settings.json file. The next thing that Gemini CLI takes care of is the environment variables, and they are through .env files. So it's becoming a common practice to have our API keys like Gemini API key, Google API key in a .env file. So if you're working from any directory, it looks for .env file in the current working directory. If it's not found, then it's going to search the upwards parent directory until it finds the .env file till it reaches project root. And if it's still not able to find, then it's going to look for in your home directory. And once it finds that, this API key is required, and the Gemini API key is required, and the rest of the ones are optional. For example, you can have the Gemini model, Google API key, Google Cloud project, and all those details there. So after the .env file comes the context files, which is the hierarchical instructional context. So the context files are crucial for configuring the instructional context. This instructional context is also referred to as memory, and it's provided to the Gemini model. And this feature allows you to give project specific instruction, coding style guide, or any other relevant background information to the AI. So basically, those are details that cut across the entire project. By default, this file is going to be a Gemini.md file. So they have given an example of what goes into this file. We can have the general instructions, which could be, let's say this is a TypeScript library, and you are giving general instruction as to when generating new TypeScript code, please follow the existing coding style. And you're saying that prefer functional programming paradigm when appropriate. All code should be compatible with TypeScript 5.0. and Node.js 20. And for the coding style, you're saying use 2 spaces for indentation, and you're giving all the coding style details. And you're also giving specific components. For example, for the client.ts, this file handles all outbound API requests. Whenever adding a new API call functions, ensure they include robust error handling and logging. See how we can provide the project level coding style instruction. The general instruction also, we can get very specific about what goes into specific file. So once we give all these details in Gemini.md or your agent.md file, then the generated code is going to be much more sophisticated, is much more specific to your use case. Next comes sandbox. It's quite possible that Gemini will go ahead and execute potentially unsafe operations. So in which case, when you start Gemini, you need to say sandbox. You need to provide the sandbox option. We can just say Gemini-S, and that creates a sandbox for you, and you're in a sandbox. Or we can set the Gemini sandbox environment variable, and note that if you want to run in the YOLO mode, which is that you're going to approve of whatever the action that the Gemini CLI takes, then you need to have Docker enabled, because it's going to use Gemini CLI sandbox Docker image as default. For project specific sandboxes, you can create your custom Docker file at .gemini/sandbox.docker file. and you can have all your details there, similar to how the typical details that go in a Docker file. So that pretty much is what we need to know about the configuration of the Gemini CLI. With that, let's move on to doing some hands-on. Here's a simple application that I have created. It's just to, if you just drag and drop an image, it's going to blur the image. It's as simple as that. So to start with, I'm just going to drag and drop this image, and I'm just going to click on apply blur. So it has blurred this image. Now let's find out what Gemini tells about this project. So I go to the terminal, it's image processor. I'm just going to say Gemini, and it's started that. I'm going to say explain what's going on in this project. So it's running with Gemini 2.5 Pro, and it's not running in any sandbox environment. It started analyzing the project components. So it says the project appears to be a web application with a React frontend and the Python backend. The frontend is built with React and project TypeScript. Styled with Tailwind CSS. That's all fine. Then there's Python Fast API application. Seems to be set up for image processing, given the inclusion of libraries like OpenCV and Pillow. That all looks good. And it says, I'll now examine the main application logic, which is there in app.tsx and main.py. And then it comes up with this explanation. So in the front end, provides a user interface for uploading images, allows user to select image and from their computer or drag and drop into the application, displays the original unblurred version. So it all looks good to me. So eventually it says, in short, this is a full stack application that lets you upload an image, blur it, and then download the result. It also has features to convert image to an SVG. Next, let's move on to one-shotting and creating an entire app by one single prompt. But we are going to switch to the Gemini 2.5 Flash because we ran out of tokens. We hit the rate limit on Gemini 2.5 Pro. So I'm going to give the option for Gemini 2.5 Flash, and I'm going to start it. You can see that we have started with Gemini 2.5 Flash, and I'm going to give my entire prompt, which is that build a full stack app for task management. I want to be able to create new tasks. I want to be able to edit and delete the existing tasks. I should be able to arrange in Kanban style with the columns to do, in progress, done, and archive. And it's the standard user interface. Basically, I'm just trying to create a task management app. So let me hit enter on that and find out what it comes up with. So it's trying to do npm create task manager app, and it's got a template as React TS. I'm just going to say yes, allow, yes for execution. And it started installing the needed things. Yes, allow. Prioritizing task management. It's updated app.tsx to handle login state. That's updated. It's now creating Kanban board.tsx. So it's dealing with the user interface, constructing the card component, Kanban board.tsx, and then there's task card.tsx. It's creating all this React components, as we can see here. It's exporting those components, this task card, and then it's writing all the files. To run the application, it says navigate to task manager app and then cd task manager app and then do npm run dev. So I'm just going to do that. Or actually, let's ask it to start the application. No, because we are not inside it. So I'm going to do an exclamation mark. If I do ls, we can see that there's a task manager app. So if I do an exclamation mark and then do cd task manager app, I understand that. I will come out of it and then I will do start the app. Let's see what it does. Yes, allow once. So it seems to be struggling to just start the application. So I'm just going to do escape and come out of it and then do an exclamation to switch to the terminal mode and then say npm run dev. So it's got some error code. So I'm going to go back to the Gemini mode and I'm just going to say paste the error. Just going to give the error and let's see what it does. So it's refining the solution, accepting edits. You can see the little dots here, which indicates that it's running. So eventually I had to come out of Gemini altogether and then type npm run dev in order to start the app. We can see now that the app is running. And if we go to the user interface, it's got the registration form, not the best of looking user interfaces. I'm just going to create a username and password 123456, and I'm going to register. User already exists because I tried creating it. That's great. So I'm going to click on login and I'm going to log in. So it allowed me to log in. That's great. But again, in the user interface, it's quite basic and there's a significant lack of any CSS whatsoever. But let's see if it's functional. I'm going to add a task asking publish video, add task. So it has added a task to do. If I move forward, it's moving it under in progress. And if I move it forward again, it's moving it under done. And if I move forward again, it's moving it to archive, which is all. If I move it backwards, it's moving it backwards to done, which is all great. If I click on edit, I'm now able to edit the task, and I can add publish video on Gemini CLI. And if I click on save, that's getting saved too. So it's functional, but it's for some reason, it's completely lacking the CSS. It was the case when I tried out a different project as well. The UI was completely lacking any CSS. So that was the quick run through of Gemini CLI, guys. We looked into how we can get started with it, and we also looked into the command options, how we can configure Gemini CLI, and then we did some quick hands-on trying to understand an existing project. That went fine, and then we did some one-shotting with just one prompt, and we tried to create a task app, and that lacked some CSS and stuff, but it produced a functional app. So with that, I'm signing off, and I will see you in my next video. Until then, take care.